They nominated me for a Pulitzer for beat reporting is because I was always looking for these odd stories. And I did a story like CEOs who cheat at golf.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's episode of Sports to Business podcast. Today we have someone very special, someone that has really been around the block and knows their stuff, Mr. Leonard Jones. So welcome to the podcast. Really excited to have you on.
Thank you, Tanvir. Thanks for inviting me. I'm a big fan of your podcast, and I can guarantee you I am the worst athlete who has ever appeared on your show.
We don't really, so we have a lot of athletes on the show. We have executives, but I think you are really unique because you, I think, bridge the gap between both. And we're going to discuss that in this podcast. Before we dive in, Mr. Jones, just a quick introduction for the listeners. So a graduate of University of New Mexico, you specialize in sports writing. So I think you knew what you wanted to do from the moment you went to university. And then you're also an MBA from University of Texas at El Paso. You were a reporter for USA Today for 18 years. You had coverage of within a corporate management money section, working with the thousands of CEOs. You wrote more cover stories than anyone else in any section. That is a true accomplishment. You were selected twice by USA Today Enterprise All-Star Reporter, and you were nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in 2001 for beat coverage. You also had the most Twitter presence than anyone on USA Today at that time. And you're a novelist. You have two books, Cremation of Sam McGee, and also At the Bat, which is now number 9 on Goodreads for the greatest baseball novels of all time. What a great career. Can't wait to dive into all of these great things.
Yeah, it's been fun. It really has. And different turns, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners have done themselves, even at a much younger age. A lot of turns along the road in a career.
Absolutely. I mean, so we'd love to dive into all of these turns and twists in your career. What are you doing right now, Mr. Jones? So what's keeping you busy right now?
Well, right now I'm letting my car battery go dead again for the second time. Ever since COVID hit, I've been so homebound that I went out, finally, I needed my car and it wouldn't start. And so I'm not very mechanical, but I said, well, I'm going to replace my own battery. So I ordered a battery and replaced it. And I don't think I've started my car more than once or twice since I put the new battery in. So it's probably dead by now as well. So COVID has really made me a homebound person, that's for sure.
As with most of us, right?
Yeah.
And I'm assuming you're living in a colder climate.
I live right next to Washington D.C. It's kind of like, who knows, it's kind of on that borderline where it can get real cold. It can be real mild this time of year.
Yeah, so I recently moved to Dallas last year, and I never knew it snowed here, so I saw snow last week in Dallas. It was 40
I
degrees
saw
one
that.
day.
Yeah, I got some pictures from Austin, from some of my Facebook friends that live in Austin, and they were showing me this dusting of snow, and I just messaged back to watch out for avalanches.
I know it's funny because so I'm from Toronto, so we're going off topic here, but in Toronto, basically, 2 feet, and I'm sure you know this, like 1 or 2 feet's normal. You got snow tires on and you go. And here, when it started snowing, I actually saw less people go outside. It was just flurries. So it almost shows about the perspective that you have when you're actually in a certain situation, because you really don't know the other perspective because you haven't been there, right? So it's almost like, it made me think, that's almost same as life. It's like whatever situation you're in, whatever you're used to, you start to really make its way, and you start to really react to a situation based on what you've seen, and I think it's good or bad in such certain situations, right?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that people can get used to the conditions they're in. That is definitely true.
What have you? I'm really curious, actually, looking at your profile, and I know we've been chatting in email. Let's just go back into early career, Mr. Jones. How do you actually know you wanted to do sports writing and journalism when you went to university? So how did that whole career track start?
Yeah, I always enjoyed writing, and I was kind of surprised when I took my SAT test to go into college. I thought I would score really high in English, and I actually scored lower in English than I did in math and science, but I still pursued the writing career because that's what I enjoyed. And and it was just evident to me from reading Sports Illustrated and Sports Magazine when I was a kid that the best writing was in sports. I mean, if you're a great reporter, you may go into another area, but if you're a great writer, sports, I think, is the most creative outlet for that.
So then you saw it, you didn't get a great SAT score, but you loved sports, and you said this is something that could be where you can make a career, and then you just kind of went all in.
Yeah, I did, and I switched to business reporting when I was in El Paso. I wasn't in a big enough market. They have university sports there, but I wasn't in a big enough market to cover like elite type sports, like professional sports, really great collegiate sports. And so I kind of made a decision then and I'd heard that the fastest, they say that the fastest way to the major leagues is to be a catcher. The fastest way to a major newspaper is to be a business writer. And I had an interest in business. I always enjoyed business. So I went in that direction. Although, I still agree that sports writing, if you want to read good writing, you read the sports writing.
So did you, and I think this is a great concept because we have a lot of student athletes who listen, right? Did you know that you're going to use business writing to get your foot in the door and then build a career into sports writing? Or did you just get started in business because that's what you thought you would do?
Yeah, no, I stayed in business writing throughout my newspaper career. But then when I went into novel writing, I still had the love of sports, and I also had kind of wanted to do historical fiction because I was kind of done interviewing people, and so I went back with At the Bat, the Strikeout, the Shamed America. It's back when Casey at the Bat, the poem was written in 1888, and that was perfect because I could do all kinds of research, which I like to do, but I didn't have to interview anybody because everybody was dead from that time period.
Yes, one way to put it.
Yeah, I think they all are. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, no, I think that's really fascinating, right? So we'll keep going through your career track. So then you were at El Paso, and then what? So how was your career at USA Today? How did that evolve?
Yeah, that took off from El Paso. USA Today and the El Paso Times and a number of other newspapers were owned by a company called Gannett, and their flagship paper was USA Today, but they had all these other smaller newspapers. And USA Today was in the red for a long time before they became profitable. And to kind of fix that on their books a little bit, they like brought in reporters, which they called loaner reporters from the other newspapers for like 4-month stints to go work at USA Today, which, the reporters wanted to do. But the local newspapers hated it because they're the ones that had to continue paying the salaries of these reporters. So it was a way for Gannett to make USA Today to its shareholders look like it wasn't quite as bleeding ink, red ink as it was. And so I was one of those people. I went from El Paso to USA Today for what was supposed to be a 4-month stint, and I was lucky enough to be hired on full time after I was there.
That is, so on this podcast, right? And I chat with a lot of great folks who, such as yourself, started in a career, but then the career took a turn, and then they found something that they never thought was, would be their career. Just right off the bat, what kind of advice would you give a student athlete, or even students nowadays that are trying to build a career or are fixated on one career? Because clearly you did not know that the 4 months are going to become your entire 18 years at USA Today. How should people think about that navigation in their career, if you want to call it that?
Yeah, I'll give you the advice I would give myself if I could go back 30 years. I didn't think about it at the time, but when I got out of school, I thought I wanted to go into law school, but I didn't, I looked at the jobs in law and I didn't want those jobs. I didn't want to be a lawyer. They weren't kind of people you see on TV. They're kind of mundane, crank out the hours kind of work. And so I didn't get a law degree, but looking back as a journalist, I would have gotten a law degree and then tried to work my way into like covering the Supreme Court. So you use your education on something you're interested in, But if you don't want to do the work in that field, you figure out a way to spin that over into kind of the career that it'll work in. And that example wouldn't work for everybody with just a law degree, but if you think about it, they can probably take an interest of saying, I'd like to study that, but I don't want to work at that. But how can I take that knowledge and apply it elsewhere, kind of like a
Yeah.
skill stack kind of thing.
Especially in today's world, because what you do in school is changing rapidly with technology, right? So I think if you can learn about a topic that interests you, but you don't want to have a career in that, you can learn about a topic, you get the insides, you understand the foundations, and then building a business or doing something that you can leverage that knowledge, I think makes total sense. It's a great way to put it.
Yeah, and you don't always see it when you're in it, but I'm seeing it in my own children now. They're kind of early on in their careers, and I'm kind of seeing how kind of these odd things that they're interested in are kind of like,
Yeah,
playing a role in where they're headed.
absolutely. In your USA Today, I know you met with a lot of CEOs, and in your entire reporting career, business, sports. Let's dive into what was the most fascinating thing that you saw in the way these CEOs ran their business. And I know there's a lot of influence from sports, but what was that thing that you're like, what, this is crazy to almost an extent?
Yeah, I don't know if it's crazy so much as that the CEOs don't really fit kind of a mold. I interviewed hundreds of CEOs of top companies, and it just amazed me how the personalities weren't the same at all. I mean, there's introverts. In fact, I think they've done surveys. There's almost as many introverts rise to like Fortune 500 CEOs as there are extroverts. So it doesn't really fit. Kind of, they do have to learn, like an introverted CEO does have to learn how to be extroverted in the right situations. I mean, they can't like just hide from
Not
everybody.
talk.
Yeah, don't talk. So they train themselves to be extroverted, but you can't like really change your personality. And so that was always interesting to me. And then I also did the reason I won, they nominated me for a Pulitzer for beat reporting is because I was like always like looking for these odd stories, and I did a story like CEOs who cheat at golf, and so I interviewed a number of CEOs, and one of my tricks was you can't really get a CEO on the phone saying, I want to talk to you about CEOs who cheat at
Cheated
golf.
golf, yeah.
They call it collecting string, and I would be interviewing for a couple of months all these CEOs about kind of the projects they wanted to be talking about, kind of their new product or whatever. And then I'd always have these, 2 or 3 questions about these other stories I wanted to work on over time. And at the end of the interview, I would say something like, do you cheat at golf? And since, I had them, they either had to say no comment or answer the question.
Yes.
And, every one of them, of course, said, no, I don't cheat at golf. And so I followed up, well, do you know CEOs who cheat at golf? And they go, oh, yeah, I played with CEOs all the time that cheat at golf. And so I was able to like build the story based on that. And I did the same thing with CEOs who were spanked as children. I mean, guy, if I called the PR department
Yeah.
of Apple Computer or something and say, I'd really like to get your CEO on the phone to ask him if he was spanked as a child, they would just laugh and hang up on me. But if you could get them for something else, in fact, I would always, when other reporters on other beats had executives into the office to be interviewed, I would always ask to be invited to those interviews, and I would sit there quietly and let them do their interview. I wouldn't interfere with the story they were working on. And then at the end, I would train them to say, Del, did you have anything you wanted to ask, when they were done with their interview? And I'd say, oh, yeah, I do. Were you ever spanked as a child? And everybody would just kind of like roll their eyes. There goes Del again, but they were kind of trapped, and they would kind of have to answer
Had
the
to
question.
answer.
Yeah.
They had to answer, right?
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Now I'm going to take a different angle here. Again, coming back to working towards getting something that you're looking to achieve. What this shows me, Mr. Jones, is you knew that you wanted to get a story of who cheated golf, and you were willing to put in the work to actually interview CEOs about something totally irrelevant so that you can get in front of them and at the end actually ask about what you really wanted to do, right? So I think that entire work and planning, it's tremendous. Like how much went into just for you to get that the final thing that you really were after.
Yeah, the trick is just kind of thinking ahead, having a couple of story ideas. For me, it was stories. It would be
Yeah.
something else for other people, but thinking ahead of what down the road do you want and how can I like do it while I'm doing my other work. I mean, you've seen those boxes where they, you do things that are like important, but not crucial and that kind of thing. And there's that one box that everybody forgets is things that are important to do, but aren't urgent.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And this is something to me that was important to do. I wanted to write really good stories about CEOs, but out of necessity, it wasn't urgent. So when I was doing all these other urgent things, I mean, I was interviewing them for actual stories. It wasn't like I was just like faking them out that I wanted to talk to them about this. I was actually writing these other stories, but I was always looking at that box of what is important, and important to me was like a really good story,
Yeah.
and out of necessity, it wasn't urgent. And so you always have to look at that box, that important but not
Yeah.
urgent box.
So that's a great advice because I've been taught that in school, and it's like, well, only focus on most important and most urgent, because that's what really matters. And I think that goes with the thinking that nowadays everybody's always about short-term results, right? It's all about quick, fast gratification. But do you feel that even in your career, right? Let's say you're a young person and maybe you're give some advice here on a lot of the younger students here or athletes that are watching. If you have some sort of an aspiration, which is important but not urgent to get there, it's going to take you some time to get there. Should you be actively planning on things that you should be doing today that'll help you get there? And if so, how do you do that?
Yeah, you definitely should. The trick is kind of like knowing where it is that you're
The
headed.
North Star, right?
Yeah, yeah. And when I wrote my two novels, uh, it's really easy to kind of like go off into tangents when you're writing, and then at the end, all of a sudden, it's like impossible to tie it all back together. I think a lot of writers like get to that stage where they're doing all these subplots and everything, and then at the end, it just doesn't come together. So when I was writing the novels, I would like know what the end of the novel, that's the first thing I would think about is how is this book going to end? And then when you're writing and you're like going off on all these subplots and tangents, you just ask yourself, am I going to is that making me go toward the place I want to be at the end? And it worked. I had to rewrite my book once because when I got through with the first draft, my most important character, who is the umpire and Casey at the bat, when I read the book, he was the most boring character. But I didn't have to change the plot at all. I just had to figure out how to make this character, my main character, less boring because all these other side characters were, to me, more interesting. And so I gave the umpire, I put him on the spectrum, which in 1888 nobody knew what the spectrum was, but and it's not mentioned in the book, but anybody who reads the book and sees kind of the things that this umpire does, the modern reader realizes he was on the spectrum, and that changed him from just kind of a boring umpire to kind of a more interesting character. And so I just had to rewrite the book. It was a lot of rewriting to get that in, but at least I didn't have to tear it all up and come up with a new story.
And that's brilliant, right? Because you knew where your North Star was or what you wanted the book to deliver at the end. I see a lot of that right now. So let's say in consulting, right? There's this thing where, especially or you're an MBA, and MBA students the mistake they would make first when a case presentation is not giving the solution up front. They walk through the analysis, they would walk through all the details, and then they'll say, "Well, recommendation at the end of the presentation is this." And most of the times when they do that, the analysis doesn't really drive the recommendation. So what I've seen actually, and this is, I don't know, like I think this is across every spectrum, whether it's writing, as novels, or as consulting, right away at the top, great consultants would say, here is a recommendation, and we're going to walk you through how we came to this conclusion, right? So I think this is a very similar concept of in your career, your North Star. Here's where we're going to get to. Here's the 3 or 4 different things I have to do in the next 5 years. Writing a book, the ending, consulting, here's a recommendation. So I think having the North Star first helps you align all your actions so that you can actually be working on things that will help you achieve your North Star.
Yeah, I think that's right. In fact, I've read some academic papers and they have exactly that problem. You get to the conclusion and you go, "Wow, what a great conclusion." But where was all the information throughout the rest of it that kind of supported
Yeah,
that and or at least led to that? I mean, it may have been in there scattered around, but it was never focused enough toward their conclusion. That you read the conclusion, you go, "Wow, that's a great conclusion," but where's the rest?
yeah, exactly. You mentioned your book, so let's dive into it, Mr. Jones. So walk us through the book that you wrote, how you came up with the inspiration. I know you said you mine poems, and it's a poem from the 1800s. So what was that like? And just a bit more information on the book.
The first novel I wrote was The Cremation of Sam McGee, which is also built on a famous poem by Robert W. Service, one that my father, who is 96, has memorized by heart. And so I grew up hearing that poem and actually tried to memorize it myself and only got about halfway through. And then I decided to write a novel about it, mainly because when I started writing novels, I considered myself a pretty good writer, but I had trouble like conceptualizing an entire story that would fill a novel. And that gave me kind of the platform, a story, that has a story. And now I can build, make up my own story kind of built around that story. And that's what I did with Casey at the Bat. It's got to be kind of like the most famous poem. And there's definitely a story there, and everybody who's read the poem knows what the ending is. So I knew going in, kind of everybody would know how the book ends, but I could use my writing skills to like talk about not only at the game, but like what happened before the game and what happened after the game. After Casey struck out, what happened to him, because he was now the GOAT, and I had him basically becoming this strikeout king for another season. He couldn't get his head together because all the fans were like, hassling him at every game.
Yeah.
And then the umpire who was telling the story, I actually, the reason I chose the umpire as the narrator of the book is because I'm a sports official myself. I officiate 3 sports, primarily high school level. I'm not a high level official, but I know enough about umpiring and refereeing to know kind of what it feels like to be in that position where either you missed the call and everybody hates you, or maybe you even got the call right, but half the people hate you anyway because it was just so close that they're seeing it a different way. And so
Yeah.
that's why I wrote it from the umpire's point of view, because I thought I would have a pretty good perspective of that.
I mean, that's so bang on because we've lost some great games in my career in university football, and I think half the time it was like the referees didn't like us today.
Yeah,
It was
I doubt if that's true. I mean, there's a possibility that that's true, but I
yeah,
doubt. I mean, officials make mistakes all the time, but I doubt if they're doing it because they didn't like you. Although, there's some probably with enough thin skin that they don't go into the game that way. But if they're getting hassled enough by a
a
coach
player. Mm-hmm.
or a player, yeah, I could, it takes a
Little bit of bias.
yeah, a good official like says, no, I have the fortitude. I'm gonna call balls and strikes. I'm gonna call this exactly how I see it, no matter
Yeah.
whether this coach over here is a really nice guy, this coach over here is a really asshole. But it's my job to do it right down the middle.
Yeah.
And I think most officials, at least when they get to an advanced level, feel that way.
Talking about baseball in the 19th century, I know that you also mentioned something around how women were an untapped market. Can you share that story and how that really led to revenue for the entire game of baseball?
Yeah, that's interesting. I found out when I was doing research on umpires back then that they didn't have the power to eject uh, players and coaches. They only had the power to fine them, and so uh, of course they, when they got a lot of trouble, they would fine them, probably a lot of money for those days. But the team owners, because they thought it was good for the gate, for this kind of friction going on with the umpire, they thought it was good for the gate, so the team owners would pay the fines, and so you can imagine how that turned out. An umpire thinks that he can control the players and the manager by fining them. Well, he can't, because the team owners are paying the fines, and that actually. And I read a lot of newspapers from the late 1880s about, just baseball games, baseball stories, and it was amazing how often the reporters blamed the umpire for the loss. It was like just a common theme, more so than today. I mean, if an umpire or a referee blows a call, it showed on replay on TV a lot. But back then it was only newspapers, and it was just constant. About half the stories, maybe it was just the half stories where the team lost that the newspaper was reporting on, but it was always blamed on the umpire. And then finally, and a lot of them got beat up, and uh, and umpires back then, they were primarily former players. They were kind of like, they would hire recently retired baseball players to be umpires. And if you look, you can find a list of them on Wikipedia, all the major league umpires. And if you go back into that time of period, you'll see that hardly any of them lasted more than a season. They would retire from baseball, they would go into umpiring, and by the next season they would be gone. And I think a lot of that is because they didn't like it and they quit. And another reason is because the team owners every year got to vote how they selected the umpires. They got to vote for the umpires they wanted. And so if there were 10 teams, they would all maybe vote for their top 5 umpires they wanted. And so the ones that got the most votes would be the umpires. And so, as an official, I know that the more someone sees you, even if you're a good official, the more a player or a coach sees you, uh, they can start to lose respect for you, because they forget all the good calls you make. But if they see you enough, they're going to see you miss a call or think that you missed a call, and so their impression of you kind of falls. And my guess is that these owners probably voted in brand new players thinking, well, they've got to be much better umpires than the ones we had last year. Yeah, and they voted in. And getting back to your question about women, the beating of the umpires actually stopped, or went down a lot when the team owners realized that there was a potential fan base among women. They started to notice that there were women in the stands, and so they tried to clean up the game, kind of like cleaning up hockey, clean it up a little bit, hoping they could get more women in
Oh, that's good.
attendance.
That's amazing. Yeah, and I mean, hockey fighting's gone down in the past 10 years.
Yeah.
And like I remember like early 2000s when I was in school, I used to watch hockey. It was like, hey, there's a fight. Toronto Domi would always fight every second game. You don't see that anymore.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
it's
The
deliberate.
old the old joke, there was a fight and a hockey game broke out or something like that.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, that's a great story. So let's jump into how I think you work with the CEOs, and I know there's a lot of you interview CEOs, you've asked them stories about how they cheated at golf, but there's one thing that I want to really dive into, especially for our listeners who are in corporate, are on the path to CEO, are managing teams. Why do most CEOs that get to that level have an athletic background? How does that play a part in their career? And what can young aspiring leaders today do to mimic some of those behaviors?
Yeah, it does. I mean, there's a great correlation. Even I did a story 20 years ago, even about women executives.
Mm-hmm.
That, I mean, women's sports weren't as widespread then, but the women who were advancing were more likely to have an athletic background and more likely to have a team athletic background. And some of that's obvious. You play in a team sport, and there's a lot of things you have to learn One of them, I interviewed Larry Brown one time. He's the NBA coach for Detroit, and also coached the Olympic team. It was kind of the dream team that kind of failed.
Yep.
It went to the Olympics, and everybody thought they would win every game by 30 points, and I think they wound up with the bronze or the silver. And I interviewed him one time, and it applied so well to business, is that you got to have the star players, you got to have the stars in business, and you reward them by paying them more. But in return, they have to be humble around, they can't be prima donnas, because that's just going to screw up everybody else working as a team. So you pay your star players more, but you expect them to be good team players, and that applies to sports and business
So
equally.
true.
Yeah.
So true. It's like having a team of a lot of, like, I always use this phrase where you want to have a team, you want to have a superstar team, but not a team of superstars that can perform. Having a bunch of great high paid players, put them together in a locker room, they can't get along, you're not going to win.
Yeah, and that may be why they lost the Olympics that year. They had all the
And the
NBA
ego.
All Stars, and all the collegiate All Stars were winning
Yeah.
gold medals easily at the Olympics, and then all of a sudden they brought in NBA All Stars, and they couldn't get the job done.
I mean, you're seeing a lot of teams. So what is it that great businesses do when they're building teams? How do they actually build a team around a few great star players?
Everybody, I've seen your podcast, and everybody needs to work hard. It's like important that everybody gives the great effort, but there's also what they call B players. I mean, there's people that work hard that just are never going to be A players, but they're important to every organization, not the low, the C players. In fact, I interviewed Jack Welch, the former General Electric CEO, one time, and he was real controversial, because at that time he would go through General Electric, which had this huge workforce, and he would want 10% of all General Electric's employees to be gone every year, that they would be fired, or the bottom 10%. And I mean, that didn't go, I mean, kind of kept it a little bit of a secret. I imagine more CEOs actually probably do that without saying it. Uh, but I got him to talk about it, and he basically said that it's kind of compassionate, because if somebody is on the job and they're not doing the job, they're not happy on the job, and it's hurting the organization. And his philosophy says, they need to be go and do something else. They might actually be good workers if they were in another situation. And he saw it as more of a compassionate move, of like, why make these people like miserable for 20 years until retirement or something, when they're not performing. And if I get rid of them, maybe they will be happy, maybe they will find their niche somewhere else. I thought that was kind of an interesting perspective, kind of taking the spin of it's not mean to do it, it's actually compassionate.
It's very interesting, right? Because I mean, I definitely see that point. It's might as well be make the choice that is not the most popular choice right now, but the right choice in his mind, right? That's very.
Yeah,
Go ahead, please.
and it helps the other people at the company. I mean, everybody working knows who the slackers are,
Mm-hmm.
and it hurts morale, especially if you're doing team projects. Every team has the free rider, the people that do all the work, and the free riders, and
Just
so
hand
everybody
them off.
knows who they are. So it hurts the rest of the team when those people hang on as well.
This also reminds me of let's say football training camp. Every year you have to go and try out, even if you are a star player, unless you're the star quarterback for 10 years. Yeah, everybody has to go and try out, and you have to fight for the position every single year. And at the end of the training camp, there's a certain number of people or players that are let go, right? So some players every year may have been a star player last year, but you always see news that so and so team, NFL, CFL, released this running back or this defensive lineman, and that's a very similar concept to what you're mentioning. Jack Welch was saying, it's like, hey, get rid of the bottom 10%. It might be something where in sports you can't perform. It's a very results driven organization, and if you can actually measure results, I think that might be something that businesses could use. But the hard part is, how do you actually measure whether or not the results the individual got in business are because this person's capability, or is it because this person was not enabled to deliver results?
Yeah, that's a
That's where
good
it gets
point.
gray.
And it's a point that I asked Jack Welch, and he agreed. And there's favoritism. I mean, if it's the managers that are kind of like you make the manager rank everybody under them, like top 10% and
Yeah.
bottom 10%, it can be a personality thing. There may be a high performer that he puts in the bottom 10% just because there's a personality clash.
Yeah.
And Jack Welch, realized that that was a problem. But you're right, it comes out of sports. Jack Welch was a football player,
Yeah.
and a great golfer. He was one of the greatest CEO golfers ever. And so he was a good athlete himself. And I'm sure he kind of learned that principle from sports, is that when you're in sports, from junior high on, the low performers get cut from the team. I mean, that's
the
and
reality.
it's hard. It hurts. I've been there. It hurts to be cut from a team, but that's just the way sports are.
There's also another thing that came to mind as you're touching on this, Mr. Jones. It was, some players will do really well in a certain system, but they will not perform that level in a different system. So, for example, if you are a defense in football, let's take an example, and you're built on really letting the linebackers make the plays, and the defensive line is there to keep the O line away from the linebackers, right? A linebacker in that system will do very differently in performance, maybe great, maybe not so great, versus a system where the defensive linemen are actually asked to make plays versus keeping the linebackers clean. This is where I think a lot of players also need to realize. Now, I'm going back to the leadership of emerging leaders. You have to be in a system or in a corporate organization that's going to allow you to play to your strengths, because it doesn't mean you're a bad player. It means you're not in the right system.
Yeah, that's true. In fact, I have a personal story. When I was at USA Today, I had one boss who was very hands-on, kind of wanted to know everything I was doing at every minute. He like sat, I don't know if you've seen a newspaper newsroom, but they're wide open, and there's no offices, and he's like sitting like two desks in front of me, and all he has to do is get up and talk to me. And so I had this very hands-on micromanager type boss. And then all of a sudden I got a new boss who was not only the opposite of this boss, but he was in New York. So instead of having a micromanaging boss two desks in front of me, I had a boss that I could go a week without exchanging emails with.
Wow.
And he was in New York. And so, and that kind of bothered me a little, because I was used to, with this other boss, of sending him like 5 story ideas and say, like, which one do you think I should work on? And then I would email this new boss kind of the same thing, and I would just get crickets, nothing back from him. And so one time I was with this Mark Greenberg, who is with Chubb Insurance. He invited me to a Washington Nationals baseball game one time, and we were sitting there, and I this is just when this was going on, and I told him the story. I said, it's kind of frustrating. I got this new boss that is just ignoring me, and he gave me the best advice I ever had. He said, if your boss is ignoring you, that means you're doing a good job, because your bosses spend all their time with problems, and so if you are not a problem if he is ignoring you. And I go, wow. And from that point on, that's when I like started writing these stories. Like, I wouldn't, with the other manager, I would have said, I want to do this story on CEOs who cheat at golf, and he might like shoot it down, like that's impossible. You're never going to get enough CEOs to talk about that. But with this new boss, I never even brought it up. I just worked the story, and then when I had enough for the story, then I would write kind of a synopsis of the story I wanted to do, and it would like sing. It was like, it would be like a really good synopsis of what I was going to do, because I had the story reported, but I wouldn't even tell him. And he would go, wow, that sounds like a really good story. Go do it. And so then I would just write it, because I had everything I needed to do the story.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, I'd be working on something else I didn't tell him about. And being able to self-manage in that situation it just like kind of
awesome.
turned my career around, I think.
And it also forced you, from what you're telling me, to really grow into that leader, because you had less oversight and you had to really manage yourself as your own boss.
Yeah, and I
Right.
never did. I don't think I would make a good manager. I never led people, but you're right. There is a leadership ability in, even if you don't want to be the boss, to be the boss of yourself takes leadership
Awesome.
skills.
Well, it's a great story. No, that's awesome. Um, before we end this episode, Mr. Jones, let's just, if you can highlight your book, Case of the Bat, and where can people find it, and any other places that they can go and download the book or buy it, please, if you can share that.
Yeah, it's in three. At the Bat, the Strikeout, the Shames America is in 3 versions on Amazon. You can get the Kindle, you can get the print book, and there's an Audible book that I recorded, which I had a lot of fun doing, and that's on Amazon and on Barnes and Noble, and if you can't remember the name of the book, if somebody's driving and listening to this, if you go to the Amazon site and search Strikeout in their search bar, it's like, every time I've tried it, it's like in the first 3 hits with just the word strikeout, which is it helps me market, because I can tell people, oh, just go search strikeout. They don't have to like write down this long title.
Yep. So make sure you guys search Amazon with Strikeout at the Bat, and please read the book. It's an amazing book. And where else can all of our listeners and viewers find you on social?
Primarily, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm fairly active on Facebook, but that's primarily with friends and family. So I kind of steer any professional contacts to LinkedIn.
Awesome. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for jumping on. It was really great. I mean, I love the stories. I always love having someone who can connect the sports, the executives, the leadership. I think you shared a great ton of stories here, and I'm sure all of our listeners are going to really take this advice back and apply it to their life. So thank you so much for jumping on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tanvir. Enjoyed it. Great conversation. Great questions.
Thank you. Team, remember to like, subscribe, and share with a friend, and visit tanvirbango.com for a ton of free content and exercises.